Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. My name is Keith, and I will be your host today as we journey through the important storytelling implications of the idea of the alien in science fiction. I said this week, but I have been your host for the last 3 weeks. This is the third one that we've done together, which is pretty exciting. I would like to think so, at least. I've enjoyed it so far. Hopefully you guys have as well. So getting right into it, last week we talked about symbolism and its use in storytelling, specifically symbolism in science fiction, and the importance of understanding and being able to kind of wrestle with symbolism in science fiction so that we can, squeeze as much meaning as possible out of all of the science fiction stories that we know and love. This week we're going to be talking specifically about the idea of the alien in science fiction. And I don't mean the alien as in like the franchise, the Alien. I mean the alien as in a concept of an external force, most often represented as a living being that has heavy implications into the story itself. So science fiction as a genre, as we've been discussing, relies heavily on a number of different storytelling mechanics in order to convey meaning to us as consumers of the genre or of whatever art form we're consuming science fiction in. And a few of these storytelling mechanics are as important as this concept of the alien. The alien, as I was saying before, is most frequently depicted as an organism. It's usually humanoid in its nature, either in appearance or its interactions with the world. And as I mentioned last week, we're going to be hard-pressed to find an example of a popular science fiction story or franchise that has an alien that is at its core not human in some capacity. The alien in science fiction serves a lot of purposes, and quite frequently its primary function is to affirm the setting. And as I mentioned last week, science fiction is a very setting-heavy genre. A lot of the allegory or symbolism or meaning that is to be found in science fiction stories relies pretty heavily on us as consumers of the piece buying into the setting, buying into the prerequisites of the world. So even just admitting that under these circumstances an alien exists, we are buying into some part of the setting. So what do I mean by affirm the setting, that the alien affirms the setting? The alien exists as a symbol, as a bridge between our disbelief of the setting as the consumer, viewer, or reader, and the setting itself. So imagine Star Wars, but with only humans. It would be like a pretty radically different kind of story. The setting would, in some capacity, probably feel even more fantastic. And a good example of this, good is debatable, would be the way that the movie Krull is shot, or even Dune is another good example of this, where it's just like a lot of people existing in the stars and the aliens don't necessarily play as much of a role, but they're still there. But just kind of on that same wavelength, what you usually end up with is a more fantasy-like setting when you have only humans in the setting. And part of why we don't get this very often is that in science fiction there is suddenly access to an infinite galaxy, and the only sentient beings available to populate it are human. I think that, like, subconsciously that just doesn't make sense to us, and consciously it seems pretty unlikely. So the existence of the alien serves to affirm one of the primary functions of science fiction, that being the idea of progress or futureness, which is one of the core requirements of science fiction, is that it exists in a world where there is access to something that is new or futuristic or that we don't currently have access to, whether that's knowledge or technology. It's a very important aspect of science fiction. And with that knowledge and that technology, there are just a huge set of consequences all their own. And that's part of what, makes a good science fiction story, is the journey through those consequences. Now, in this particular case, the alien as a symbol, the alien presence affirms progress because they serve as an easy foil for the idea of progress. That we as a species or a society have advanced enough to expand our knowledge beyond the confines of what we would know to be some form of contemporarity, as in like contemporary. We've expanded beyond the contemporary because the conditions of our existence have been altered enough to justify the establishment of a new norm. That norm being that we do not occupy infinity alone. So this kind of gets to like a subconscious role of the alien in science fiction that I wanted to kind of touch on briefly. The idea that ultimately we as humanity are not alone in the universe. The presence of the aliens in science fiction subconsciously affirms the idea that there are other intelligent life forms that exist within the galaxy. And in a way, this kind of serves as a comfort, because really what's more terrifying to the subconscious mind? The idea that an alien spaceship might show up and attempt to take over the world via technology that far surpasses our own, or that nothing ever shows up, and that this tiny little blue marble is careening haphazardly through the infinite expanse of nothingness, and it's the only thing available in all of that infinity that has the ability to support life. I think that psychologically, the second one is much more terrifying, because as individuals, we are social beings, but not only that, I think that sentience and consciousness cries out for more sentience and more consciousness. It searches for other things to affirm its existence, because it would confirm that the individual experiencing it is not alone and is somehow correct in their interpretation of the world around them and of consciousness itself. So that's part of the reason why I would argue that the second one, that being that we're ultimately alone, is a lot more terrifying. And even science fiction like The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells employs the idea of the alien in this capacity. But it's kind of in reverse, right? So the main character of H.G. Wells' short story, novella, The Invisible Man, Griffin, is the one who becomes the alien, and that's part of why it's so terrifying. You could make an argument that the alien in that particular story is the concept of invisibility, and now Griffin has interacted with it and thus made himself or cut himself off from the rest of society. But I would say that in Griffin's recluse tendencies and single-minded desire to prove his hypothesis, he turns himself into the alien in the story. Because when he does achieve invisibility, it gives him access to knowledge that allows him to transcend a very basic aspect of humanity in some capacity, because he's invisible and now he's no longer beholden to trivial things like social mores and like ownership. He can kind of, as long as he's not wearing other clothes, act indiscriminately. And it's this uniqueness and single-mindedness that he acquires because of that exclusive knowledge that ultimately affirms his alien status and his demise at the end of the story. So since we kind of jumped into this without like giving a firm definition to the alien, what I had said previously was that the alien as a symbol is an external force usually represented via a being that is humanoid in some capacity that acts within the story as a catalyst or an agent of change. So part of the reason that I'm making the argument that Griffin is an alien in his own story is because he has access to knowledge that makes him into an external force that is easily othered by the people around him, because he has to wear bandages over his face in order for people to not just think that he's a ghost. And something else that I'd like to kind of mention, another example of science fiction that examines the idea of the alien, but uses kind of like also in the same hand the idea that humanity is alone in the universe, that they're the only sentient occupants, is the movie Interstellar. I'm not a huge fan of the ending of this movie. I loved most of the film. I thought it was incredible. Cinematography, the score brings me to tears every single time. Hans Zimmer did an amazing job. And who doesn't love a good Matthew McConaughey flick? But I think ultimately it belittles its own point by drawing a concrete conclusion about this idea of the Watcher. And that conclusion is that like the Watcher or the occupants of the universe are humans with more wisdom than us because of their existence in the future. So that about covers it for the first few minutes. We'll get straight back into this right after this commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. Right before the break, I was talking about how I think that ultimately the explanation of the force that is kind of like the mysterious Watcher in Interstellar, I found that it was a disappointing way to end that particular film. I probably should have said spoiler alert, but I don't think that information will necessarily ruin the film for you. I'm a big proponent of watching something for the journey that gets you there, and that the knowing the ending or not knowing the ending isn't pertinent to your ability to enjoy something. So I apologize if I spoiled anything for anyone, but ultimately I think that the main part of that film is the journey that you take to get there, and definitely not the twist in quotes at the end, because the ending is still pretty ambiguous. That's just one of the possible ways that it could be interpreted, and it's like the main one that most people interpret it as. So back to talking about the alien in science fiction, this idea of the alien as a symbol. Another purpose that the alien can serve in science fiction is as the foil for existential provocation. The alien can exist as leverage for the story to solicit deep thought and consideration. So when I say existential provocation, what I mean is that you have this being or creature that exists in a capacity that forces you as an individual to kind of re-examine existence as a concept or your perception of existence. So a great example of this is the Ray Bradbury short story Fire Balloons, I believe is the title. It's in the Illustrated Man collection, which is a collection that I highly recommend. If you are a fan of science fiction, if you're a fan of literature, if you're a fan of good writing, it's definitely worth a read, and it doesn't take too long. So in this particular short story, people have settled or civilized Mars, which is a pretty common premise in a Ray Bradbury short story. And they have had brief contact with what they believe are the natives of the planet. So the story centers around a religious man's desire to bring God, God in quotations, it's the Christian God, to these natives. I believe he's specifically Catholic. The natives are large, glowing, sentient orbs, hence the title Fire Balloons. Though it is unknown at the beginning of the story if they're sentient or not, by the end of it, we're pretty clear on the answer to that. So as the main character goes out to meet these creatures, he believes himself to be committing some sort of like greater good. But as he begins to interact with these creatures, he comes to realize that they, in fact, already know God. So when they tell him that they know God, they try to tell him it's the same God, and he tries frantically to explain to them that their God is not the God, but they're able to affirm through a series of like dialogues and debates that it is indeed the same like Catholic/Christian, the Judeo-Christian God, and that he is in fact in need of saving by them. So they share with him this exclusive knowledge that makes him believe that he is in fact unworthy of life and actively detracts from the Christian/Catholic message. And he decides to attempt to remedy that situation. And that is my PC way of saying that he jumps off a cliff. I just try not to be too lighthearted, but also try not to be too uncouth with that particular information. So he attempts to kill himself, but because of the enlightenment that the spheres have, they can't allow him to hurt himself, and they won't allow anyone within their range of power. They have like telekinetic powers to hurt themselves because of the knowledge that they've had access to. So they save this guy, I think, several times. He may even end up in an infinite loop of like falling down a cliff to his death but not dying. I don't remember exactly what the ending of the story is, but part of the point is that he is faced with the horror of knowing that he has to continue on now, even though he's become privy to this knowledge that surpasses his capacity as a human being to know. So he doesn't want to actually know what it is that they told him, because it ultimately creates a sort of existential crisis for him, because he believes himself to be a holy man, but he is in fact actively detracting from like the enlightenment that God has to provide because he is acting in ignorance, whereas these spheres on Mars are not acting in ignorance. They're acting out of knowledge and out of true enlightenment. And they've passed this knowledge on to him, but he doesn't know what to do with it. So he's stuck in this place, this terrifying place of having knowledge that everything that he does is ultimately futile because he does not have access to this particular way of being that the alien spheres have access to. So in this case, the aliens have effectively served as the provocateurs of existential thought that this story is exploring. And that being, what if God has revealed itself or himself, whatever, you believe in a more profound and meaningful way to other life forms in the galaxy. And then, of course, we are forced to examine what are the consequences of such knowledge being revealed to human beings and the consequences of that potentiality in the first place. In this particular case, we as the reader are forced to acknowledge the horror of the unknown become known that the religious man now has to face, because he is stuck in this awful limbo of knowing that, again, everything that he does is futile because he cannot gain access to this particular form of being, which was given to the natives of Mars because of their access to enlightenment. Now, this use of the alien in science fiction, the alien as a symbol, is really common in a lot of the franchises that we are familiar with. And part of what makes the use of this type of alien, this alien as a symbol in this way, is so interesting is that ultimately through a reversal of roles, we're forced to find meaning or examine what it is that the author is trying to say. The alien is traditionally an outside entity that exists as an external force that forces our eyes inward. So another story in literature that does this is Ender's Game, the Ender's Game series by Orson Scott Card. The primary source of conflict in Ender's Game, on its surface, seems to be the war between the humans and the buggers, or the formics, the ant-like creatures that are supposedly infringing or encroaching on humanity, and they initially represent an existential threat in the form of humanity's extinction. But as the story progresses, we come to find that the true enemy of humanity exists within. And this is really similar to Ray Bradbury's story, because the religious man who goes out to talk to the spherical aliens on Mars believes that he is doing some sort of good and that he is an agent of good, rather in the same way that Ender is made to believe that he is an agent of good by eliminating the threat of the buggers or by going to war with the buggers. But ultimately, the alien in both of those stories is going to serve a much deeper purpose. But we'll get to more on that right after this next commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and we are back with the GSMC Science Fiction Podcast. Right before the break, we were talking about the use of the alien as a symbol and the way in which the alien is used in Ender's Game. So to get more into that, Ender doesn't face life or death conflict in his battles with the buggers. He works through some sort of like virtual reality platform. But instead, his conflict is with his fellow students and with himself. And it's there that he really faces a lot of like life or death conflict. And ultimately, as we reach the climax of the first book, spoiler alert, I guess, we realize that it was in fact humans who encroached upon the formics/buggers and not the other way around. So Card forces us to look inward through the use of an external force to figure out who is really the horrifying threat to life in the galaxy. And ultimately the answer to that is humankind. And it's a threat to life in itself, and that it's not the buggers that are that threat. And this idea is really common. I think part of what makes the alien so pervasive in science fiction is that it's ultimately a representation of something within humanity. It's an archetypal expression of an aspect of what it means to be human, which is why aliens are hardly ever depicted as being all that different from humans. So a really horrifying example of this are the xenomorphs in the Alien franchise. Just to confuse you more, now we're going to talk about aliens in Alien. So the xenomorphs represent the consumptive evil that exists within individuals, which, as I mentioned last week, I think is partly represented by the xenomorph's primary mode of reproduction, that being the use of like face huggers, ovipositors, and like a general form of parasitism. They are, in addition, a punishment brought onto us by the desire to surpass our own humanness, and this is evidenced by the two most recent prequel films. So therefore, it is fitting if the punishment for our curiosity is the result of something within us and not an external force. Ultimately, the xenomorphs are simply a force of nature that exists within the capacity of humankind. The desire to consume, the desire to destroy, and the desire to dominate. All of these evils are things that exist within humankind, and they're realized through the birth of these creatures from the very body that we occupy. It's not a coincidence that we as an audience are so horrified by the xenomorph, nor is it a coincidence that they take like a bipedal form with goals that we can comprehend, that being to like eat or to feed or consume. So the alien really ends up not being all that alien, which is likely the primary reason that it's so ubiquitous, fascinating, horrifying, etc. The alien is a way for storytellers to force us into examining an aspect of the self. Because what's more terrifying than having that which is most foreign already exist within the thing that we believe to be so intimately close? This idea of the self. So the alien forces us as an individual to look inward. Do we really know the self? Do we really know what lies within? I think that's part of why you could make an argument that the face huggers, the ovipositors, the primary reproduction method of the xenomorphs is so horrifying, is because the idea of this monster from within becoming actualized and killing the thing that it came from isn't really all that far-fetched from our subconscious. A film that does this particular thing where it kind of forces us to look at, how well do we know the self. A film that does this impeccably, I've mentioned several times on this podcast, and I'm sure I will mention it again because I was just blown away by it, is the movie Annihilation. So the film centers around a team of individuals who enter into the Shimmer, which is a slowly expanding phenomena that centers around the crash site of a meteorite. And that is literally all that we have to know, like everything there is to know about it before going into it. That, and that everybody who enters the Shimmer has proven to be doing nothing other than basically committing suicide. And that, like, every team beyond the second team, I don't remember exactly how many teams there were, has met their demise in a mysterious fashion, in that the people who are researching it, the military, ultimately have no idea what happens to anybody who goes into the Shimmer. So when Natalie Portman's character, whose name escapes me at the moment, first enters it, as she and her team progress closer and closer to the epicenter of this phenomena, things start to get really weird. We learn about the team that entered into the Shimmer previously and what happened to them. We see the fates of specifically Natalie Portman's husband and his team. And what makes all of this so terrifying isn't necessarily just that this alien force exists in almost the literal backyard of a highly populated area, because part of the reason that they're so frantically researching the Shimmer is that it's slowly expanding and it's starting to encroach on more populated areas, and they're having a hard time keeping it under wraps. What makes it really terrifying is that the Shimmer does to that which we believe ourselves... Sorry, I'm misphrasing this sentence. What's terrifying is what the Shimmer does to that which we believe ourselves to have known. So this is another primary function of the alien in storytelling, is that it exists to be an existential, like I said, provocateur of that which we believe to be concrete. But specifically what I'm kind of trying to get at is that the alien serves as a way to challenge that which we believe to be axiomic. An axiom is a reference to like a mathematic principle. So the Shimmer in this film represents an alien force that alters the biological components of life. But it's not the mutation or alteration that solicits the most horror from us as a viewer. It's the ability to alter these components. It's what the ability to alter these components does to the self that we thought we knew that is so horrifying. So basically what the Shimmer does to our biological components isn't as terrifying as what the alteration to our biological components does to our mental components, our idea of the self. What the changes to the biology does to the idea or the existence of our psychology. That's part of what makes it so terrifying. Not that it isn't terrifying to think that like the biological components of our body could be altered by an external force, but I would say that one of the main reasons that the movie is so terrifying is because it so effectively kind of challenges what the idea of the self is supposed to be, if the idea of the self is rooted, at least in part, in the biology of our being. So if you change the conditions of our biology, what does it do to the conditions of our psychology? But we will talk more about that right after this last commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello, welcome back. I think I said hello already. I am like 99% sure that I said hello already too. You kind of run out of things to say after you come out of a commercial break after, I don't know, like the first time. So welcome back to the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast. I, just as a reminder, am your host, Keith. We're getting towards the tail end of this today. So we were talking before the break about the movie Annihilation. We've been talking for the entirety of this podcast about the importance of the use of aliens as a symbol, aliens as a storytelling device in science fiction, and what purposes that they can serve to help make a story better or augment a story. So back specifically to Annihilation. So the shimmer, part of what makes it so terrifying, part of what makes it such a good science fiction concept, is that the shimmer augments an aspect of humanity that we pretend doesn't exist. And I think this idea, the idea of being forced to look inward by an external and foreign force that seems to lack motivation, that we believed to be so intrinsic, is part of what draws people to science fiction in the first place. So we believe that this thing that we're looking at inwardly, this thing that's being put right in front of us, we believe that there is some sort of intrinsic motivation as to why we would be forced to look at it. But because it is often something that's being kind of like forced right in front of us, forced into our face or into our thought process, that forcefulness that lacks motivation, or like the smugness of a person being right, is kind of what helps to make science fiction interesting to a lot of people. Because I think that ultimately we as individuals are profoundly aware of these aspects of self that are given life through the use of the alien in science fiction. Our subconscious actively knows that we have within us the capacity to create progress, or bring peace, or bring destruction and evil into the world. War of the Worlds, another H.G. Wells novella, short story, whatever you'd like to call it, isn't just a simple invasion story. I think subconsciously it's a story of the conflict within the self. But here it is easier for us to reconcile that conflict because now it has been made foreign, made not human. The aliens are not human, and the conflict that we have with these aliens that are motivated by something that we have no relationship with, that's been othered. And just like we can't escape the aliens, we can't escape our humanness, even in stories. Our humanness that we know has within it the capacity to destroy worlds, even if it's just in some small regard. So it becomes terrifying to see an external representation of that destruction, and we can face that representation of destruction because it's hidden in all these layers of otherness. It's hidden in a spaceship that we look at that's just so huge that we can't even comprehend how it traveled across the galaxy. Like Independence Day would be a good example of something like that. And I think ultimately that this is really the true purpose of the alien, to obfuscate the point of the story, to give us the ability to say when we look for a threat or progress or change, it comes from an external source. But ultimately, I think that as consumers of science fiction or as readers, as human beings, subconsciously we know that the forces that cause all of those things simultaneously exist within us and external of us, but still like in other people who aren't as real to us as our individual self is to us. So someone else's experience, the forces existing inside somebody else, they're not as real as they are when they exist within us. So we can continue to hide the acknowledgement of those things in layers of otherness. So aliens give us this non-threatening, often fantastic representation of some archetype within the self that we can pick apart, apply motivation to, sympathize with, be horrified by, etc. And that is where the real beauty of the alien in science fiction lies, in its profound ability to make what is internal external and palatable. Though palatable might be a bit of an exaggeration. I don't know how palatable it would be to see a xenomorph in real life, and it most certainly is not palatable to deal with like a facehugger or a Wookiee. I imagine that a Wookiee would be very stinky. So that's all I've got for this week in this regard. I wanted to touch briefly on something a lot more lighthearted. I kind of like to mention something that I'm excited about in the world of science fiction at the end of the podcast. So this week I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if you count it as science fiction, but it's a video game movie, Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm actually really excited about this movie. Back when I started doing podcasts for GSMC, I started with just the movie and the music podcast, and we talked about the original character design versus the new character design of Sonic. I'm really pleased with the new character design. I think they did a great job, and apparently it really didn't cost them all that much money, which is awesome. And I mean, however, it did delay the film's release pretty far. I think it ended up being like a full quarter that they had to wait extra, so a full 3 months. But Jim Carrey as a villain, I'm all about it. I honestly will probably see the movie just to see Jim Carrey's portrayal of Mr. Eggman. I know that video game movies are pretty frequently the butt of a lot of jokes, and for good reason. But I am legitimately excited about this one, and I hope that you will check it out. I know that I will be checking it out for sure. And I still haven't seen the new Star Wars, so I've got that on my docket as well. I'm sure that once I see it, I'll want to talk about it, so there will be a review of some sort. So that's about it for me. Oh, I apologize. I had one other thing. I had a series of books recommended to me called Hyperion, the Hyperion Chronicles, or the Hyperion Cantos, which is a series of books written by Dan Simmons from the late 80s up to the mid-90s, it looks like, is when the last book was published. These have been highly recommended to me several times, so I will be reading them in the next few weeks, and I am sure that I will want to talk about them. We may even get a full podcast out of one of them, depending on how good it is and how much I can advocate for it without spoiling it. If you all would be interested in doing a walkthrough of the book with me, kind of as like a science fiction book club, then definitely let me know in the comments below. We should have like an email or something so that people can send in requests and let us know their thoughts outside of reviews and such. So I will work on getting that information for you guys if it's available. You could always @ us on Twitter. Definitely go ahead and click that like and subscribe button if you like what you heard and you want to be kept up to date on everything that is the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast. My name again was Keith, and thank you for listening. I hope that you have a wonderful week that is full of self-reflection on the importance of aliens in storytelling. Thanks, guys. Have a nice day.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.